Hi, what's up today?
I'm not feeling too good. I just heard that the Irish government has to give more money to the banks.
How much more money?
They don't know. Maybe another 30 billion.
What do you mean maybe another 30 billion? How come they don't know? How much have they already given to the banks?
I don't know. It's hard to keep up with all the announcements that they need to give more money to the banks.
But where is the government getting all the money to give to the banks?
Up to recently, the government had to borrow the money from the bond market so that they could give money to the banks. But the bond market doesn't want to loan any more money to the government because it thinks the government already owes too much and won't be able to repay its loans.
What is the bond market?
The bond market is where people loan money to the government. Many of the people who loan money in the bond market are the banks.
Hold on. I don't understand. Are you saying that the government is trying to borrow money from banks in order to be able to give more money to the banks?
Yes.
That makes no sense. What kind of crazy system is that? That cannot be true.
It is true.
But why is the government borrowing money from the banks in order to give more money to the banks?
Because the banks lost a lot of money making bad loans. The banks owe a lot of money to other banks and now they can't pay back their loans. The government is giving more money to the banks so they can pay back the loans they got from other banks. There are also other reasons the banks need more money. But we would need another conversation to go into that.
So the Irish government was borrowing money from other banks in order to give more money to the banks so that these banks could repay their loans to other banks? And the other banks wouldn't loan any more money to the Irish government because they think it has already borrowed too much. So where did the government get the 30 billion to give to the banks?
From the EU and the IMF. The EU told the Irish government that it had to give more money to the banks so the banks could pay the other banks. But the Irish government can't borrow the money because everybody knows they won't be able to repay it. So the EU and IMF loaned money to the Irish government.
But if everybody knows the Irish government won't be able to pay the money back, then why did the EU loan it more money?
I don't know. Maybe one reason was that the other banks are mainly European banks. And they don't want the Irish banks' problems making more problems for these banks because they are already in trouble. And maybe another reason is because they are afraid of the market. In other words, they are afraid of the banks.
This sounds a bit crazy. Why would they be afraid of the market or the banks?
Because all the countries in the Eurozone borrow money from the banks. And they are afraid that the banks will charge them too much interest if they don't behave in a way that the banks like.
So every country in the Eurozone needs to borrow money from the banks?
Yes. Nearly every country in the world needs to borrow money from the banks.
But where do the banks get all the money that they loan to the countries?
Mostly they get it from the central banks.
But are the central banks not owned by the governments?
Not really. Most central banks are independent of the governments. They decide how much money should be created. Then they loan it to the banks at low interest rates. The banks then loan money at higher interest rates to everybody else, including governments.
The central bank gives money to the banks so that they can loan it to the government at a higher interest rate?
Yes. And that's not even the most crazy thing. The banks are also allowed to create new money out of nowhere and loan this to the government at interest. So the government ends up in more and more debt through borrowing money that doesn't exist from the banks.
That's unbelievable.
Yes. But it's true.
But why do governments allow this to happen? This system makes no sense. The only people who profit from this are the banks. And what you're saying is that when the banks get into trouble for making bad loans, that the government borrows money from the banks to give more money to the banks.
Yes. So the government has to increase taxes and cut back on public spending to get more money to give to the banks.
I'm getting angry. I still don't really understand where the banks get all the money from, and I don't know where the money seems to have disappeared to. Can you explain that?
Yes. But it will have to be in another conversation. As I said at the beginning, I'm not feeling too good.